He became.
Well, William Jennings Bryan was also a mix. He was, of course, had been nominated 3 times for president by the Democratic Party, the only person to be nominated 3 times and lose. And he was a progressive and a populist. He was, William Allen White once said, the famous editor from Kansas said that William Jennings Bryan was the closest thing to socialism the American mind could tolerate. He was close, the most radical person who ever came that close to being president. He was he was a strong believer in controlling big business, in controlling railroads, in nationalizing industries, in breaking the gold standard, and helping the common people. And that stayed with him. He remained a progressive throughout his life to the end. He was a fierce opponent of Coolidge and Harding and the Republican administrations by the 1920s. He was a pacifist who campaigned against World War I and against militarism for disarmament. So in that sense, he would be comparable, if I had to pick a name, because he was also a great orator. He was most famous because he could put these ideas into words that people would buy. So I'd have to compare him with something like Jesse Jackson today.
But he came to Dayton, Tennessee for the Scopes trial in 1925 as a fundamentalist.
He was also a fundamentalist. He was also it's not like we use the term fundamentalist today. It was the term they used back then, but back then fundamentalism was a much broader term. It was more like saying you were a traditional Christian, a traditional Bible-believing Christian, as opposed to a literalistic fundamentalist. He didn't believe in a 6-day creation 10,000 years ago. He believed the earth evolved over eons and eons of time. It wasn't in that sense he was a narrow fundamentalist, but he was a devout conservative Christian. He had held the number 2 position in the Northern Presbyterian Church, the United Presbyterian Church. He'd almost been elected moderator. He came in second, and he was the vice moderator, the second top role. So he had a strong religious background, and he also wrote a weekly column that was published in most newspapers in the country. I think it was called Bryan's Bible Study. And he wrote many books about religion. In that sense, trying to think of a person like that today, I might think of somebody like Charles Colson, who is an evangelical religious spokesman, but not a minister, a lay spokesman who's widely known and has a regular radio show. And so he combined 2 roles: a leader of still the Democratic Party, committed Democrat, a leading Democrat, liberal politician, but allied with conservative forces due to his religious beliefs on some issues.
How long was the trial?
The trial lasted essentially a week. They had jury selection on one Friday, which was thought it was going to last a long time because Clarence Darrow was famous for using days to assemble a jury. He had a different strategy here that made it much shorter. He just wanted to expose to the public, because it was a trial geared for the national media, expose to the public that these jurors didn't know anything about evolution. And the idea was to show the specter of having a trial where you judge the merits of a scientific theory and have it by people who didn't know the scientific theory.
Let me ask you about this picture, and what I'm most interested in you talking about is the microphone.
Oh, yes, the WGN microphones. It was the first broadcast trial in American history. It was not viewed at the time as a serious trial. It was viewed as a media event, even by the judge and the participants. Of course, that's why the city held the event. And so what they did is, after the interest in the trial grew steadily in the 2 months before it was launched, and especially after William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow volunteered to participate, WGN, which of course is the radio voice of the Chicago Tribune. WGN, of course, stands for World's Greatest Newspaper, and that's the nickname of the Chicago Tribune. And that was their radio voice back then. And it would broadcast much broader than it does now. It's still the main news station in Chicago, but it broadcast much wider then. And they had arranged to broadcast the trial live. They hung special phone lines from Dayton up to Chicago to carry the radio broadcast up from Dayton. And then they needed to put microphones up, and they'd never broadcast this sort of event before, and so they thought it would be better to have 3 microphones. In reality, it caused a crosswave in the sound, but they had 3 large microphones, and where they wanted to put them was in strategic locations, which meant they had to move the jury box. And it was symbolic of the whole trial that they took and moved the jury box out of the center stage of the trial and put microphones in, a media trial rather than a serious jury trial. And from those microphones, it was broadcast live nationwide via WGN. It was also broadcast out into auditoriums around town where this overflow crowd could listen.
Let me go back to this picture if I can, because I want to ask you just to make sure we know where the microphones are. Is that a microphone there in the back where the fellow's standing?
No, that's a newsreel camera.
Okay. And then but the one there in the front is the microphone.
The microphone's in front. It's one of the three in front, and I think, and you can see WGN. That's Dudley Field Malone standing with his arms crossed. But I should also mention that newsreel camera. The entire event was filmed on newsreel cameras. The cameras were left right in the courtroom. They filmed the entire thing. They built the first airplane airstrip in Dayton. They cleared a cornfield, I think it was a cornfield, out near town, and every day planes would fly in and pick up the newsreel footage and fly it up to northern cities where it was shown at night, that night, in Cleveland, Detroit, and New York, and then recopied and sent all over the country so the entire country could watch the trial. So it was, not only was it broadcast live on the radio, but it was in the movie halls all over town that night or the next day. That shows the level of interest in this. That shows it as a media trial. And those were new things. They'd never broadcast a trial. They'd never filmed a trial before.
Well, by the way, was there a jury?
There was a jury. It hardly ever was sitting. It was only in the courtroom for 30 minutes over the week-long trial. The trial then lasted for a week, and then they had closing arguments, what were scheduled to be closing arguments on the following Monday, and that was the trial. But the poor jury, because most of the battles were fought over legal issues, such as whether the judge would rule that law was constitutional or not constitutional, or whether the expert witnesses could testify, those weren't matters for the jury. So the jury, which had all lined up, everybody had agreed to be a juror because they thought they'd get front row seats in an overflow courtroom. It ended up the jury was in for about a half hour, which was the length of time it took. The entire prosecution case was a half hour. They brought in a couple school students to testify that Scopes had taught evolution. They just established the case that he taught it, and then they rested their case. And then it was the defense that tried to bring in expert witnesses, great scientists from around the country, to explain what evolution was and to show why a law against it would be unjust and improper. The
jury was out to make this decision for how long?
Oh, well, all they did was walk out. They only met for about 20 seconds. They had to get out of the courtroom, and the courtroom was so packed that I think the entire event took them about 15 minutes because they had to be let out through all these people. They never went to a jury room because that was all filled with press people working up their material. So they just stopped in the hallway, and they all agreed, because Clarence Darrow had asked them to convict Scopes because they wanted to appeal to a higher court. And so it took them about 15 seconds. They just acknowledged that they agreed right there in the hallway, and then they filed back in through the crowd and issued their verdict.
And he was convicted of a misdemeanor, and it was a state law.
Yes.
That what? Say it again.
The law said that it was a crime to teach the theory of human evolution in public schools. For a public school teacher to teach the theory of human evolution in public schools, and then it went on, in contrary to the biblical story of creation. And that's why the defense tried to argue that the theory of evolution isn't in conflict with the biblical story of creation, because you could believe that God used evolution as his means of creation. But of course that evidence, which they wanted to get in, the judge said no, said it was not relevant. The law was clear. The law said you couldn't teach human evolution, gave effect to only the first part of the law. There was uncontroverted testimony that Scopes had done it. They never put Scopes on the stand because, of course, he'd have to admit that he never taught evolution, and they wanted to keep that out because they wanted a clean case. And Brian also wanted a clean case. Both sides wanted a clean case. And so there was the conviction that the penalty was, it was listed as a misdemeanor, and the potential penalty was from $100 to $500, and the